Hi everyone, I'm Jessica, and my research topic is social emotional learning. And there's a couple other aspects of that I will talk about in a little bit. But first, a little bit about me. I graduated in 2012 from USD. I got my degree in marine science as well as a psychology minor. And I've spent the last almost 8 years working at SeaWorld, most of that time with animals. So that's me and a sea lion named Murdoch in one of my last sea lion and otter shows. But I recently stopped doing that so that I could start student teaching at Valhalla High School. I just finished my first week of student teaching, so it's been fun so far. And then I also coach JV swim at Helix High School. So this presentation is going to talk about my research. There are 3 different parts of my research topic that I brought together to make one big paper. I'm going to talk about why I chose my paper or why I chose my topic, the research and resources that I used, and some of the methods that I would use for data collection and analysis, and then what I plan to do with this after our class. So to start off, I knew that I wanted to focus my research on students with limited or interrupted formal education. So this basically means that these students came to the US in 2nd grade or after and have 2 fewer years of education than other students their age. And because of the gaps in their education, they often don't have the skills to reach grade level academic achievement. And this is actually a really large part of our high school population. I found a statistic that about 11% of the 10th grade students in the US are considered students with limited or interrupted education. So moving on from that, I've noticed, especially in the school district that I work in, EL students, including students with limited education, are usually immersed in general education classrooms. And that's mostly due to things like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Every Student Succeeds Act, which require that students, including disadvantaged students, including English language learners, that all students have access to high-level education. So most school districts interpret that as we will put all these students in the same classes, regardless of their academic ability. And yet we still have the achievement gap, which all of us have learned so much about, which in my mind really calls the immersion method into question. So that leads me to my first research question, which is, when considering various instructional methods, is immersion the most effective method for teaching these students with limited or interrupted education? And here's just a little example of that achievement gap. You'll notice in the English learner column, there is the least amount of success and the greatest amount of failure in the CASP math category. So that's the state test that they take, and math is just one of the subjects they take that test in. But again, the least amount of success for English learners. So then that led me to the third part of my research, which is, how do we make immersion better for these students if that is where they're going to be? If they're going to be in general education classrooms, what can we do to enhance their learning experience? So my answer to that is social emotional learning. So the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, which is comprised of social workers and school psychologists and people that are working with these students every day, they developed 5 different tenets of social emotional learning, which are self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And I really believe that social emotional learning addresses the unique needs that these students with limited education have. So in addition to learning English, they are also adapting to a new culture. They are also coming from areas where they've experienced trauma, possibly, or conflict, and moved around multiple places before they have landed in our schools. So that leads me to my second question, which is, how does social emotional learning contribute to the development of these students with limited education? And specifically for my study, I was going to look at 9th grade students, and specifically refugees from the Middle East. We'll talk about that in a second. So my motivation for choosing this topic, again, is the achievement gap. I've seen firsthand so many students coming into our schools who, regardless of their motivation, regardless of how hard they work, they just don't have the academic skills to achieve what other students at their grade level are achieving. And specifically in my area, I live in El Cajon, California. We have a very large Chaldean population. So these students are immigrating here from Middle Eastern countries where, again, they've probably experienced trauma. This is probably not their first stop on their journey leaving their home country. And because of all of those changes in their life, they have missed a lot of school. So that's why I chose that population and why I think this is so important. So back to my research process, I started again with the problem, which being the academic achievement gap and the students being immersed in general education classes when maybe they're not necessarily ready for that. So my next question is, how do we make immersion more successful for this specific group of ELs? And I knew I wanted to look at students with limited education who are coming from Middle Eastern countries, but DeCapa and Marshall actually gave me that definition that I was able to use to expand my research because I wasn't sure exactly how to phrase that. So the students with limited or interrupted formal education is a DeCapa and Marshall term that I was able to use for a lot of my research. And then again, I wanted to look at implementing social emotional learning and not just how that benefits EL students or specific groups of ELs, but also how that benefits high school students, because so much of the research I found was looking at elementary school students. And it's very common to implement social emotional learning at the elementary level, but it's not as common to see that at the high school level. So that was the third part of my research. And in terms of gathering and interpreting data, the method I would use is I wanted to implement social emotional learning in 9th grade humanities classes. So that would be English as well as social science, because those teachers do work closely together, especially at the school that I work at. And also, that would give students 2 different opportunities to experience social emotional learning. So 2 different teachers might implement it slightly differently, and one of those ways might connect more closely with some students than others. So then I want to implement it in the spring semester, so I can use the fall semester kind of as a control. So students would take a pre-survey at the end of their fall semester, reflecting on their experience during fall. Then we would implement social emotional learning in spring, and they would take a post-survey at the end of spring, reflecting on their spring semester. And the surveys would include 2 different kinds of questions, Likert scale questions, so ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and then also free response questions. And for the Likert scale questions, I would be able to use quantitative data analysis, so just give a number to each of those responses and figure out if there was a significant difference in student experience before and after implementing social emotional learning. And for the qualitative data, I would use grounded theory to sort the concepts and categories of the free response questions. So to wrap it all up, I want to implement social emotional learning in 9th grade classes to figure out if that is something that will provide enough support to warrant continued immersion for students with limited education at the high school level, and if we are doing enough to help these students and how we can start closing that achievement gap. So during my research process, one of my aha moments would be, don't be afraid to print. I think I made my life more difficult by saving paper. I didn't want to print all of my articles, so I tried to organize them on my computer. And if I had just printed, I think at least the abstracts, it would have been much easier to organize all of my research before starting to write. And then as far as my future plans, I want to finish up student teaching. So that will go through May. And then I'm hoping to get a job in Grossmont Union High School District, hopefully at Valhalla High School where I'm student teaching. And if I do end up at Valhalla, I would love to be able to actually move forward with this research and seriously consider trying to implement this at Valhalla, because that is where this large population of Chaldean students is. And that is all I have. Here's some of my resources, and thank you for listening.